Maya Collins wiped the dark wood surface of the corner table, her movements slow and rhythmic. Outside the large glass windows of the small cafe, the heavy evening rain had finally stopped, leaving the pavements of downtown Boston damp and shining under the yellow street lamps. At 26 years old, Maya no longer moved with the bright, sharp energy of a professional dancer. Her posture softened by long shifts on her feet, and the quiet weight of unfulfilled dreams. Her light blonde hair was gathered in a loose knot at the back of her neck, framing a face that remained striking, despite the faint shadows of fatigue beneath her clear blue eyes. A coworker walked over from the counter, holding a small envelope made of thick, cream-colored paper, and placing it gently next to Maya's cleaning cloth. Someone had dropped it off at the front desk earlier that afternoon, leaving no name or message, only her name written across the front in neat, dark ink. Maya dried her hands on her dark apron before lifting the flap, her heart giving a slight, unexpected thud against her ribs as she slipped the card out. The words were printed in elegant gold lettering, inviting her to celebrate the upcoming wedding of Oliver Cross and Penelope DuPont at a grand downtown hotel this coming Saturday evening at 6 o'clock. The paper felt cold against her fingertips as she read the lines a second time, the letters blurring slightly before her eyes. Oliver was the man she had once shared every dream with, the person who used to wait by the stage door with a jacket to wrap around her shoulders after long rehearsals. He was the one who had promised to stay forever, right up until the dark winter afternoon, when the doctors told her that her shattered ankle would never allow her to dance on a professional stage again. When the bright lights of her career faded into silence, Oliver had packed his bags and walked out of the hospital room, leaving her alone with a broken body and an empty future. Now he was preparing to marry a wealthy heiress whose family owned half the luxury properties in the state, a choice that seemed perfectly practical for a man who always looked for the easiest path forward. Maya placed the invitation face down on the counter, the smooth paper suddenly feeling too heavy to hold, and forced herself to finish wiping the table until the wood reflected the dim lights overhead. That night, she sat quietly on the old fabric sofa in her small apartment, watching the dark water droplets slide down the glass panes while the television murmured in the background. Her roommate Ruby came out of the small kitchen area, holding 2 mugs of warm tea and sitting down on the opposite end of the couch with her legs crossed. She looked at the invitation sitting on the coffee table and told Maya that she should go to the event, if only to prove that she had survived the damage he left behind. Maya offered a small, tired smile, shaking her head as she took a sip of her tea, noting that she did not have the right clothes or the confidence to face a room full of wealthy strangers. Ruby leaned forward, placing her mug down and arguing that Maya had spent the last few years rebuilding her life from nothing, showing a quiet strength that Oliver could never understand. She insisted that Maya should not hide away in the dark just because an old shadow had reappeared, suggesting that showing up was the final step in letting the past go completely. Maya let out a dry laugh, asking if she was supposed to magically find a handsome prince in the next 2 days to walk through the doors with her. Ruby smiled, tapping the edge of her mug and saying that the world had a strange way of balancing things out when people least expected it. She reminded Maya that she still had her grace, her pride, and a dress in the closet that had never been worn, which was more than enough to face anyone. Maya looked back at the window, the quiet persistence of her friend slowly chipping away at the heavy wall of doubt she had built around herself since the morning the invitation arrived. The grand ballroom of the hotel was filled with the bright shine of massive glass chandeliers that cast a warm light over the polished marble floors. Maya stood just inside the tall entrance, her fingers tightening around the small fabric clutch bag she held against her soft blue dress, which fell in quiet folds around her ankles. Her blonde hair had been styled into gentle waves that rested against her shoulders, and a touch of light gloss gave her lips a small hint of color against her pale skin. She had arrived by herself, her heart beating rapidly against her ribs as she watched the elegantly dressed crowd moving across the floor, laughing and holding crystal glasses filled with clear drinks. She took a slow step backward, suddenly feeling completely out of place among the expensive suits and diamond jewelry that filled every corner of the vast space. She murmured to herself that she would take one quick drink from the tray near the door, stay for 5 minutes to prove she had come, and then quietly disappear back into the night. As she turned around to find the exit, her shoulder bumped into a tall, solid figure standing right behind her, causing her to stumble slightly on her low heels before stabilizing her balance. Maya began to apologize immediately, looking up as the words caught in her throat when she saw the man standing directly in front of her. He was exceptionally tall, wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit that seemed to absorb the bright light of the room, but it was his appearance that made her stop completely. His hair was completely white, falling in clean, sharp strands across his forehead, and his skin was beautifully pale, almost like polished stone under the yellow chandeliers. His eyes were a cool, striking gray, sharp as cut glass, watching her with a calm, unblinking intensity that made the loud noise of the ballroom seem to fade into absolute silence. He looked down at her for a moment, his gaze resting on her face, before he spoke in a low, smooth voice that carried a distinct, quiet gravity. He noted that he recognized her from the small cafe near the financial center, where he occasionally sat by the window during the early hours of the morning. Maya felt a sudden warmth rise to her cheeks, stammering a quick confirmation that she did work there, while wondering how someone like him could possibly remember a simple server from a crowded coffee shop. She began to step aside, apologizing again for her clumsiness, and explaining that she was just about to leave the event before causing any more trouble. The white-haired man gave a polite, measured nod, preparing to let her pass, but a sudden noise from the middle of the room made Maya freeze in place. She turned her head slightly and saw Oliver walking toward the entrance, his arm linked with Penelope's, his face wearing the same confident, familiar smile that had once defined her entire world. A sudden wave of old hurt and sharp panic rose in Maya's chest, the thought of being seen alone and discarded by the man who had abandoned her becoming completely unbearable. Without thinking, she turned back to the pale stranger, her fingers reaching out to touch the heavy fabric of his sleeve as she spoke in a small, desperate whisper. She looked directly into his cool gray eyes and asked him to please act like he loved her, just for a few minutes, until she could find a way out of the room. The silence between them lasted for several long seconds, while the white-haired man studied the slight tremble in her hands and the faint shine of tears at the edge of her eyes. Then, without a word of question or hesitation, he offered his arm to her, his movements smooth and steady, as he told her to come with him. Maya looked at his arm, then up at his calm face, realizing that this mysterious man was offering her a shield she did not expect, his expression completely free of pity or judgment as he guided her back into the crowded room. Gideon Winters walked beside Maya through the middle of the ballroom, his posture completely relaxed and elegant, as if the grand space belonged entirely to him. As they moved past the small groups of talking guests, the loud chatter slowly began to drop, replaced by quiet whispers and turning heads as people noticed the white-haired man. Maya kept her chin held high, her hand resting lightly on the cool fabric of his arm, though her heart was pounding so hard she was certain he could feel it through his suit jacket. Gideon leaned down slightly, his cool breath brushing against her ear as he told her to keep looking straight ahead and ignore the voices around them. Oliver's voice cut through the soft classical music playing in the background, calling Maya's name with a tone that mixed surprise with a hint of quiet amusement. Maya stopped, turning slowly to face her ex-boyfriend, who stood a few feet away with a tall glass in his hand and a sharp, assessing look in his eyes. Penelope stood beside him, her gaze sliding down Maya's simple blue dress before landing on Gideon, her expression changing instantly from cold indifference to complete shock. Oliver took a step forward, his eyes fixed on Gideon's pale face and white hair as he extended a hand, introducing himself and noting that he had not expected to see someone of Gideon's standing at a private family celebration. Gideon did not move his hand to take Oliver's, keeping his arm bent so Maya could remain attached to him. his gray eyes turning remarkably cold as he simply stated Oliver's name. Penelope quickly intervened, offering a tight smile as she remarked that it was quite surprising to see Maya attending the event with such prominent company, especially given Maya's recent quiet lifestyle. Oliver gave a small, condescending laugh, mentioning that he was glad to see Maya had finally moved on from her old troubles and was finding a way to enjoy the city again. Maya felt the old familiar knot tightening in her stomach, the weight of their judgment making it difficult to find her voice as she tried to form a polite response. Before she could speak, Gideon shifted his position, his movement remarkably fast and smooth, as he stepped closer, placing a steady hand firmly around her waist. Without a word of warning to the couple standing before them, Gideon leaned down and pressed his lips to Maya's in a warm, lingering kiss that completely silenced the small circle of guests watching them. His hand held the small of her back, with a gentle but protective pressure, his skin feeling surprisingly cool against her skin, yet providing a solid anchor that kept her from falling. Maya's eyes widened in surprise, but she did not pull away, feeling a sudden, strange sense of safety wrap around her as the rest of the room seemed to disappear. When Gideon finally broke the kiss, he kept his arms securely around her waist, turning his sharp gray gaze back to Oliver and Penelope, with an expression that carried a quiet danger. He spoke in a calm, flat tone, telling Oliver that he should be very careful about the way he addressed Gideon's future wife in a public space. A low murmur ran through the small crowd that had gathered around them, the word fiancé bouncing from person to person as Oliver's face turned completely pale with disbelief. Penelope stammered out a quick word of congratulations, her voice tight and strained, as she tried to maintain her composure under Gideon's unyielding stare. Oliver looked as though he wanted to ask a dozen questions, but a member of the catering staff approached to inform the wedding party that the main dinner was about to begin. Gideon gave a single, dismissive nod, turning Maya away from the couple and leading her toward the tall glass doors that opened out onto the quiet, dark balcony, overlooking the city lights. The cool night air washed over Maya's face as they stepped onto the stone balcony, the loud music of the ballroom fading behind the heavy glass doors. She pulled back slightly, releasing her hold on Gideon's arm and looking up at him with wide, confused eyes as she asked why he had taken the charade so far. Gideon walked over to the stone railing, his white hair catching the silver glow of the moon as he looked out over the sprawling streets of Boston below. He answered simply, stating that a small lie would have allowed them to push her around, but a significant claim ensured they would remain silent for the rest of the evening. Maya shook her head, her cheeks still warm from the memory of the kiss, noting that everyone in their social circle would be talking about the engagement by the following morning. Gideon turned around, his pale features illuminated by the moonlight, and remarked that he did not care about the gossip of ordinary people, as his life operated far outside their small world. He looked down at her hands, which were still trembling slightly, and asked if she was still feeling the sting of the words her past companion had thrown at her. Maya walked over to stand near him, resting her hands on the cold stone of the railing, as she admitted that the betrayal still felt heavy, even after all the time that had passed. She explained how hard it was to feel completely discarded by someone who had promised to love her through everything, simply because her body had failed to perform on stage. Gideon watched her quietly, his gray eyes reflecting a deep, ancient understanding that seemed far too vast for a normal man, though his expression remained perfectly calm. He reached out, his long, pale fingers hovering over hers for a fraction of a second, before he gently placed his hand over hers, his skin feeling like cool porcelain against her skin. He told her that some people were only capable of loving the light a person cast, fleeing into the dark the moment that light began to flicker or change form. He stated that true strength did not come from never breaking, but from the quiet way a person gathered their own pieces together in the dark, when no one else was watching. Maya looked down at their joined hands, noting the striking contrast between her warm skin and his unusual, pale complexion, yet feeling a strange comfort in the coldness of his touch. She asked him who he really was, realizing that she had seen his name on tall office buildings but knew absolutely nothing about the man behind the white hair and quiet demeanor. Gideon offered a small, mysterious smile that did not quite reach his eyes, telling her that he was simply someone who preferred the quiet hours of the night to the bright noise of the day. The silence settled between them again, but it no longer felt heavy or uncomfortable as they stood together under the dark sky, watching the yellow headlights move through the city streets. Maya found herself leaning slightly closer to him, the fear that had gripped her inside the ballroom slowly dissolving into a calm sense of peace she had not felt in years. As the stars shifted slowly above them, she realized that this strange night was turning into something far different from the simple act of revenge she had imagined when she first stepped through the hotel doors. The black luxury sedan moved smoothly through the quiet streets, the interior filled with the soft, steady hum of the engine and the faint scent of rain from the open vents. Maya rested her head against the cool leather of the passenger seat, her eyes closing as the sheer emotional exhaustion of the evening finally caught up with her body. Her breathing became slow and regular, her hands relaxing in her lap, while the bright lights of the city streets cast long, moving shadows across her peaceful face. Gideon checked the rearview mirror before steering the vehicle toward the older, historic district of the city, where the buildings were separated by wide stone walls and ancient trees. He glanced over at her sleeping form, his jaw tightening slightly as he observed the faint line of sadness that remained etched near her brow, even in the middle of sleep. He did not wake her, choosing instead to let the quiet rhythm of the drive continue, while his own thoughts moved backward through the long corridors of his extended life. He remembered a time when the city was much smaller, when he had been forced to live in the deep shadows of the old harbor district, hiding his true nature from a world that feared anything it could not understand. Gideon pulled the car to a stop outside a large iron gate that opened into a long driveway lined with dark stone structures that looked centuries old. He turned off the engine, but stayed in his seat for several minutes, simply watching the gentle rise and fall of Maya's chest as she slept soundly beside him. He reached into the small leather compartment between the seats, his fingers pulling out an old, rectangular box made of dark wood that showed significant signs of wear around its brass corners. He opened the lid with a slow, deliberate movement, revealing a single, faded pink ballet slipper resting inside a piece of soft, yellowed tissue paper. The satin of the shoe was frayed along the edges, and the small ribbons were thin and worn from age, but he held it with a level of care that suggested it was more valuable than any asset he owned. His mind traveled back to a cold winter evening, nearly 15 years ago, when he had been forced to seek shelter in a community center after a modern conflict left him isolated and weakened. He had been sitting in the darkest corner of the large room, his pale skin and white hair drawing cruel remarks from the other youths who occupied the space. A young teenage girl with bright blonde hair and a brilliant smile had walked into the room, carrying a large canvas bag filled with old dance gear and a portable music player. She had ignored the heavy atmosphere of the place, gathering the children together to teach them simple movements, showing them how to find a sense of weightlessness even when life felt incredibly heavy. Gideon had watched her from the shadows, fascinated by the pure, unselfish light she brought into a room that had known nothing but gray walls and cold dinners. On her final day at the shelter, she had noticed the quiet boy watching her from the corner, walking over to him and pressing the worn ballet slipper into his thin hands with a gentle smile. She had told him to keep it, as a reminder that even the hardest floors could be danced upon, asking him to promise that if he ever found his place in the world, he would help someone else find their light. Gideon closed the wooden box, his gray eyes softening as he looked back at the woman sleeping beside him, realizing that the girl who had saved his spirit all those years ago had finally returned to his side. In the 3 weeks that followed the wedding event, Maya found herself living a life that felt completely detached from her usual routine at the small downtown cafe. She attended quiet art gallery viewings, private dinners in hidden garden courtyards, and classical music performances, always with Gideon standing steadily by her side as her protector. To the rest of the city's wealthy elite, they appeared to be an unusual but devoted couple. The reclusive, white-haired aristocrat and the graceful former dancer who had captured his attention. Maya kept reminding herself that the arrangement was temporary, a mutual agreement to keep the public eye away from her past. But the small details of their daily interactions began to confuse her boundaries. One clear morning, they sat together at a small round table in a secluded garden, behind Gideon's historic stone estate, the air cool and fresh under the shade of the large oak trees. A private server approached with a silver tray, asking Maya what she would care to drink, before she had even looked down at the small printed menu. Before Maya could form an answer, Gideon spoke without raising his eyes from the morning documents he was reading, requesting chamomile tea with light honey and no lemon. Maya blinked in surprise, looking across the table at his pale face, as she realized he had remembered the exact drink she prepared for herself after her longest shifts at the cafe. Another evening, while they walked through an open-air sculpture exhibit near the river, a sudden breeze from the water caused the temperature to drop rapidly, making Maya rub her arms against the chill. Without a single word of discussion, Gideon had already removed his long wool coat, draping it gently across her shoulders with a smooth, efficient movement that left him standing in his dark shirt. She looked up at him, noting that his skin did not seem to react to the cold air at all, his pale features remaining perfectly calm as he told her to keep walking so she would not catch a chill. He never initiated unnecessary physical contact, maintaining a respectful distance whenever they were alone in the large rooms of his estate or during the long drives back to her apartment. Yet, whenever they navigated through crowded rooms filled with photographers and inquisitive guests, his cool hand would find the small of her back, providing a steady guide that made her feel completely protected. She began to notice the small patterns of his behavior, the quiet way his jaw tensed when someone made a passing remark about her old injury, and the deliberate way he always let her choose when to leave an event. Maya found herself watching the light reflect off his white hair during their long conversations about music and history, discovering a deep, quiet kindness behind his cold exterior that she had never encountered in anyone else. She remembered how easily Oliver had broken his promises when her life became difficult, and she found herself wondering how a complete stranger could treat her with such consistent, unyielding care. The fear of being hurt again remained a constant warning in her mind, but every small gesture from Gideon seemed to chip away at the defensive wall she had spent years building around her heart. A heavy gray storm settled over the city on a Tuesday evening, sending sheets of dark water against the tall windows of Gideon's private residence, while the wind rattled the old trees outside. Maya arrived at the estate after an exceptionally long afternoon of physical therapy for her ankle, her entire body aching with exhaustion, and her head spinning from a sudden sharp pressure behind her eyes. She managed to take off her wet shoes before collapsing onto the large fabric sofa in the main living room, her vision blurring as she rested her forehead against the cool cushions. Gideon appeared beside her within seconds, his movements so silent she had not heard him enter the room, his pale face showing a sudden, rare look of sharp concern as he knelt by the couch. He placed the back of his hand against her forehead, his skin feeling incredibly cold against her burning flesh, as he noted that she was running a very high fever. Maya tried to sit up, murmuring that she would be perfectly fine after a few minutes of rest, but Gideon gently pressed her back down onto the pillows, telling her to remain completely still. Instead of calling for a medical assistant or instructing his staff to handle the situation, Gideon rolled up the sleeves of his dark shirt and walked quickly into the wide kitchen area. 20 minutes later, he returned carrying a small ceramic bowl filled with warm rice broth, the clean steam rising in gentle curves through the quiet air of the room. He helped her sit up slowly, wrapping a thick wool blanket securely around her shoulders, before taking the small spoon and feeding her himself, when her own hands proved too unsteady to hold the bowl. That simple. Warmth of the food spread slowly through her body, and though she felt too weak to express her gratitude, her chest tightened with a strange emotion as she watched him care for her. This man, who controlled vast networks of wealth and held a position of immense power in the city, was sitting on the edge of a sofa in a plain shirt, carefully wiping a drop of broth from her chin with a white cloth. He stayed by her side through the long hours of the dark night, changing the cool, damp cloth on her forehead every hour and monitoring the slow return of her regular breathing. When the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the heavy curtains, Maya stirred from her deep sleep, her fever having finally broken under the consistent care she had received. She opened her eyes to find Gideon sitting in an armchair right next to the couch, his white hair slightly brushed back, and his eyes closed in a rare moment of rest, though his posture remained protective. She watched the quiet symmetry of his pale face in the morning light, realizing that no one had ever stayed with her through the dark hours of sickness before, not even the man who had promised to spend his life with her. Maya walked quietly into Gideon's private study the following evening, holding a fresh cup of warm tea that he had prepared for her before he left to attend to some private business in the lower levels of the house. The large room was filled with the quiet scent of old paper and polished wood, the walls lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of books, containing leather bindings that looked centuries old. She had never spent time in this particular part of the estate before, expecting it to be cold and formal, but finding instead a warm space where a small record player sat in the corner next to a comfortable chair. Her eyes were drawn to a small, dark wooden frame that hung alone on the wall, directly above the massive writing desk, its surface catching the dim light of the small desk lamp. She moved closer, her brows furrowing in deep confusion as she studied the image contained inside the frame, her breath catching slightly in her throat as she recognized the setting. It was a faded photograph of a young girl standing in the center of a crowded room, her arms extended in a graceful spin, while a group of young children clapped and laughed all around her. The girl in the photograph had light blonde hair tied in a messy knot, wearing a simple black leotard and a pair of pink shoes that showed clear signs of heavy wear and tear along the sides. It was Maya herself, taken during one of her volunteer afternoons at the city community shelter nearly 15 years ago, a time when her heart had been entirely full of simple dreams and unselfish hope. She had never known that anyone was taking pictures during those short winter afternoons, and she could not understand how a photograph from her past could possibly end up on the wall of Gideon's private study. She heard a soft sound behind her and turned around to find Gideon standing in the open doorway, his white hair catching the shadows of the hallway and his gray eyes watching her with a quiet, unreadable intensity. She held the small frame delicately in her hands, her voice barely a whisper as she pointed to the image and asked him how he had come to possess a photograph of her childhood volunteer work. Gideon stepped slowly into the warm light of the study, his pale features remaining calm as he looked at the frame, and stated that the girl in that picture had given a lost boy a reason to survive. Maya stared at him, her mind racing as she tried to connect the powerful white-haired man before her with the memory of the thin, silent youth who had sat in the dark corner of the old shelter room. Before she could form the questions that were rising in her mind, Gideon reached into the drawer of his desk and pulled out a rectangular box wrapped in plain white paper, holding it out toward her with a steady hand. He told her to open it, his voice carrying a gentle, soft tone that she had never heard him use before. His gray eyes locked onto hers with absolute sincerity. She tore the paper away slowly, lifting the lid of the box to find a pair of beautifully handcrafted ballet slippers made of the finest pink satin, their construction perfectly balanced and sized exactly for her feet. She looked up at him, her eyes filling with sudden tears as he spoke softly, telling her that she had spent too many years walking in the shadows of what she had lost, and that it was time for her to find her wings again. The slippers fell to the desk as she stepped forward and wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, burying her face against his cool shoulder as she wept for the past she had left behind and the strange, beautiful present he was offering her. The heavy dark rain returned with a sudden force later that week, blurring the wide windshield of the car as Gideon drove Maya back from a quiet dinner gathering on the north side of the city. Maya sat comfortably in the passenger seat, the beautiful pink satin slippers resting securely in their box on her lap, her face lit by the passing green and yellow lights of the traffic signals. They had spent the evening talking about the future, about the possibility of reopening the old theater building near the river as a community dance center for children who could not afford expensive lessons. The peaceful atmosphere inside the vehicle was shattered instantly when a sudden blinding flash of white light burst from the side window, followed immediately by another bright explosion of illumination from a camera flash. A large black vehicle swerved sharply out of the dark side street, its tires screeching against the wet asphalt as it pulled dangerously close to their rear bumper, the drivers clearly trying to force them to stop for a close photograph. Gideon's jaw clenched, his pale hands tightening on the steering wheel as he told Maya to hold on tight while he accelerated away from the aggressive pursuit. The heavy vehicle struck them from the side with a loud, sickening crunch of metal against metal, the force of the impact sending the sedan into a sudden, uncontrollable spin across the slick surface of the road. Maya's small cry of fear was cut short as her head struck the solid glass of the side window, the world turning completely dark before the vehicle finally came to a complete stop against the stone curb. Gideon was out of his seatbelt before the smoke from the safety systems could clear, his movements incredibly fast as he yanked her door open and lifted her limp body into his arms. The regular ticking of the medical monitors was the only sound inside the quiet hospital room when Maya finally opened her eyes late the following morning, the bright white light from the window making her wince with a sharp pain behind her temples. Gideon sat in a chair beside her bed, his clothes slightly torn and his knuckles showing faint marks from the force of the rescue, his gray eyes watching her with an intense, silent anxiety. He leaned forward slowly, calling her name in a soft, gentle whisper, his pale hand reaching out toward her before stopping just short of the white cotton sheets. Maya blinked several times, her gaze moving blankly around the sterile room, before settling on his white hair and pale skin with a look of complete, chilling confusion that made his breath catch in his chest. She pulled the blanket slightly higher around her shoulders, her voice small and hesitant as she looked directly at him and asked who he was and why he was sitting alone in her hospital room. The simple question felt like a physical blow against Gideon's chest, the realization that the impact had taken her recent memories away, leaving him completely frozen in the quiet space. He forced himself to draw a slow, steady breath, lowering his hand back to his side as he explained calmly that there had been a vehicle accident during the storm and that he had simply been with her when it occurred. Maya looked away, her brow furrowing as she admitted that she could not remember anything about the past month, her mind stopping at the memory of her long shifts at the small downtown cafe. Gideon nodded once, his expression turning into a calm, protective mask that hid the deep ache in his heart, telling her that she did not need to force the memories to return before her body was ready to heal. The quiet rhythm of the afternoon rain tapped against the glass panes of the hospital room 3 days later, casting long gray shadows across the floor, where Maya sat on the edge of her bed. Her body had recovered quickly from the physical shock of the accident, but her mind remained frustratingly blank regarding the events of the recent weeks, a heavy fog separating her from the details of her own life. Gideon had visited her every single day, bringing her fresh fruit and sitting quietly in the corner chair, never pushing her to remember their arrangement or the promises they had discussed before the storm. After he left for the evening, Maya noticed a small wooden box sitting on the bottom shelf of the bedside table, its brass corners showing the familiar signs of age that she had seen in her dreams during the previous night. She pulled the box onto her lap and lifted the lid, her fingers trembling as she lifted the single faded pink ballet slipper from its yellowed tissue paper and pressed the worn satin against her chest. A sudden sharp memory flashed through her mind, accompanied by the distinct smell of old floorboards and the sound of children laughing in a warm, dusty community room during a cold winter afternoon. She closed her eyes tightly, the image of a thin, pale boy with striking white hair sitting alone in the dark corner of the shelter becoming incredibly clear against the blank space of her recent amnesia. She remembered the exact words she had spoken to him all those years ago, the promise she had asked him to make about helping someone else find their light, if he ever managed to escape the shadows of his own difficult youth. The wall of fog in her mind dissolved instantly. The memories of the ballroom, the protective kiss, the chamomile tea, and the handcrafted slippers rushing back into her consciousness with a force that made her gasp for air. Maya threw off the hospital blanket, clutching the old pink slipper tightly in her right hand as she ran past the nurse's station and down the wide stone steps of the building into the cool evening rain. She found a waiting taxi at the curb, giving the driver the address of the historic stone estate, with a voice that was full of a sudden, desperate certainty that could not be shaken. When the vehicle pulled up to the iron gates, she did not wait for the rain to stop, running up the long stone driveway until she saw Gideon standing alone on the wide upper balcony of the dark house. He turned around as she burst through the double doors of the dark library, his white hair damp from the mist, and his gray eyes widening in complete surprise as he saw her standing there, soaked to the skin but breathing heavily, with a brilliant smile on her face. She walked across the room slowly, holding up the worn ballet slipper between them, her voice cracking slightly with emotion, as she asked if the pale boy from the old shelter had really kept his promise for all these long years. Gideon did not move for a second, his protective mask completely disappearing to reveal the deep, ancient love he had carried in silence, before he gave a single, honest nod and stepped forward to fold her securely into his arms while the storm continued outside. The early morning sun cast a warm, golden light through the tall windows of the fully restored community center, its wide wooden floors polished to a bright shine that reflected the blue sky outside. A group of 12 young children from the local neighborhood shelter sat in a neat circle on the floor, their faces full of excitement as they watched Maya demonstrate a simple, elegant turn in the center of the room. She wore her handcrafted pink satin slippers, her movements smooth and completely free of the old pain that had once defined her posture, her light blonde hair tied back securely with a simple blue ribbon. Gideon stood quietly in the open doorway at the back of the studio, his pale features softened by a calm, relaxed smile as he watched the pure joy filling the space that had once been an abandoned theater building. He no longer wore the heavy, dark suits of his corporate office, choosing instead a plain gray sweater that made him look approachable to the children who occasionally ran over to pull on his sleeves or ask about his white hair. A year had passed since the night of the storm, a year spent building a sanctuary where the quiet or broken youths of the city could find a place to discover their own unique strengths without fear of being discarded. Maya finished her demonstration, bowing gently to the cheering children before walking over to the back of the room where Gideon waited for her with a glass of cool water and a small white towel. She rested her hand lightly against his arm, the coldness of his skin now a familiar, deeply comforting constant in her daily life, a solid anchor that reminded her of how far they had traveled together from the crowded ballroom where their journey began. They had married in this very room a few months prior, surrounded not by the wealthy elite or the prying eyes of the press, but by the volunteers, the friends, and the children who understood the true value of a safe harbor. Looking out through the clean glass panes toward the bustling streets of Boston, Maya found herself thinking about the strange, winding path that had brought her from the dark floor of the hospital room to this bright, beautiful studio. She realized that the difficult moments of her past, the broken ankle, the sudden betrayal, and the long years of serving coffee in the shadows, had not been the end of her story, but the necessary preparations for a far deeper purpose. The future no longer looked like an empty road filled with short dreams and long days, but like a wide open stage where every small act of kindness could ripple outward to change a life that was searching for hope in the dark. She knew that the man standing beside her was different from the rest of the world, a creature of the long night who possessed an ancient heart, but she had learned that true love did not require people to be perfectly identical in their nature. It required only the willingness to stay when the lights went out, to offer a cool hand during a burning fever, and to remember the promises made in the quiet corners of the world when no one else was listening. As the children began to practice their steps on the smooth wood floor, their small laughter echoing up toward the high ceilings, Maya turned to Gideon with a peaceful heart, completely certain that the light they had found together would never fade into the shadows again.